Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Logical Layman Podcast Show, episode 2. Um, had a little something I wanted to get into today. Yesterday, I saw something in the news about San Francisco was going to start um, basically overhauling their grading system, and anybody who had an F, they were going to give them a C. Anybody who had a B, they were going to automatically give them an A. Now, yesterday it was kind of fresh. I was looking into it. Um, if you look it up now, a bunch of the well, let me just show you here. All right. For those of you who don't know, allsides.com, shout out to Allsides. They give you a breakdown of like what I was talking about in my last episode. They'll show you the left and the right spin on everything. And then they'll also give you the center, like articles that give you no spin and just try to give you the facts. So they have a bias chart and everything. Anyways, this story I was reading, San Francisco schools abandoned grading for equity proposal after backlash. Now, the whole equity thing. Um, there's some different things. Like I said, this is their key takes on it. There's no spin. So it says San Francisco Unified School District have withdrawn the controversial grading equity. Now it says withdrawn. I'll get into that later too, because the agenda is always going. But anyways, it says they have withdrawn a controversial grading for equity plan after facing widespread criticism. The details, the proposed changes they based on a previously adopted practice in nearby school districts. So there is school districts already doing this. It would align the grades with system learning rather than factors like attendance and participation. Now, that's kind of I agree that scores should focus more on learning, but you got to be there if you're a part of the public education system, which I don't like. We'll get into that later too. I believe you should homeschool or send them to higher education. We'll get into why a little bit later. But anyways, I agree with it. Should focus more on learning instead of conformity, which is what we're going to get into later also. But like I said, attendance, you kind of got to be there. I don't agree with the tardy stuff where they try to arrest the parents if kids are sick too much or something like that. Life happens, and it shouldn't be forced by the government. Um, like I said, if you deal with those problems, in my opinion, homeschooling is the way. And if you don't like it, you know what logical layman says, fuck your feelings. Anyways, let's get back into it. So, it shows some key quotes in support. You know, like I said, it's going to show you both sides. Again, I love allsides.com. It gives you left, right, and the middle. Excuse me. So, Joe Feldman, who is an educational consultant in San Francisco, he reportedly considered hiring for the transition. So they were going to hire him to do it, I guess. Said that if our grading practices don't change, the achievement and opportunity gaps will remain for our most vulnerable students. Um, so basically, if you want to improve, you got to lower the bar, which is what we're going to talk about later. Also, the Department of Education has been doing since its inception, and which is why we needed to get rid of it. Um, your most vulnerable students, once they come through your educational doors, they should be level ground. You can't. Basically, what they're saying is nothing says equality and equity like treating people different. No sense. Bullshit. Once they're through your doors, you can't say they're vulnerable. They have access to the same teachers, the same material, the same opportunity. It's your job to teach them and get them to those levels. But we'll get into exactly why that doesn't happen later on in this episode. So, here's a quote from somebody who opposes a change. The former dean of the University of San Francisco School of Law said grading for equity de emphasizes the importance of timely performance assignment completion, and consistent attendance. That's right. But there's parts that you'll see how I tie it in later. It's more about conformity. You don't see anything about intelligence or learning. Which so both sides are mixing up important parts, but they're throwing in their own little bullshit to it. It shows how the media covered it. The left biased CBS said it led to a firestorm of criticism from parents and local officials. Fox News, the right wing, had a sarcastic post. They do like to clown around a lot. Said San Francisco has come up with a brilliant idea for its failing schools. Simply don't fail them. Which that's funny, but that is what they were trying to do. You can't. I love a little humor mixed with truth. Um, Newsweek, the center. That's where I found the story originally. I saw it come across my feed on Newsweek. Says they highlighted the split reactions, reporting that the critics believe the policy will lower expectations. Just what I said. You want to lower the bar to make your numbers look better, to potentially get more funding and stuff like that. And but you want to play on heartstrings and say it's for equity because everybody that comes through your door, for some reason, you can't treat on a level playing field once they're in your doors with the same information, the same knowledge. But like I said, we'll explain why that happens a little bit later. Lower S, while proponents view it as more equitably reflecting student mastery without penalizing behaviors unrelated to learning. See, now this is where I agree with that wording, but that's not what they mean. So you don't penalize behaviors unrelated to learning. Being there is related to learning, but you don't want to attendance to be a part of it. Is what was said earlier, but you know, now that's unrelated to learning. You don't got to be here. You just will give you a A or a C. If you're failing, you got a C. You passed. Participation trophy era, the dumbing down of America. Like I said, this is why I love allsides.com. Shout out. This is why I'm using their source. Um, as you can see here, they'll show you here's the center spin, here's the left spin, here's the right spin, center spin. I love Newsweek. Slightly goes to the left on some articles, but they're still always they don't have a left rating on anything that I've looked up. They're usually right up the middle. So props to Newsweek also. Um, Now what I was talking about, where all of these are saying, um, like even right here, the right wing says they ditched the proposal. The left wing says the school's back down on grading plan following backlash. So it sounds good. Like both sides came together and told them, no, we don't want to do that. But like I was saying, there's more to that. Here is CBS, which is left wing, but I'm not using it for that spin. Um, Zoom in a little bit. Back to the top. I'll show you where there makes it sound like both sides want to do something good for once. Officials in the Unified School District, San Francisco, said they have backed down on the proposal to alter the grading procedures in city high schools following widespread backlash. I want to show you something about high schools later too in this episode. Board of Education heard a proposal that included grading for equity. Like I said, nothing says equity and equality like treating everybody different. You can't go across the board on nothing. According to San Francisco, 70 teachers in 14 of the high schools were expected to participate in a voluntary program that aligned grades more closely to students' learning rather than attendance, participation, and other factors. Make that make sense. You got to be there and you got to participate to learn. It's just, I don't know. Like, as long as your name's on the roll, you pass, is basically what it sounds like to me. I don't know. What do I know? I'm just guy that actually looks up facts. Uh, report from the Voice of San Francisco said it was going into effect and that the plan would award C grades to scores as low as 41 out of 100. Wow. Led to a firestorm of criticism for parents and local officials. We owe our young people an education that prepares them to succeed. The proposed changes to grading at SFUSD would not accomplish that, said Mayor Daniel Lurie. I agree with that. There's this post. He agrees. He's optimistic that there's a better path forward. Aren't we all? That's you can't lower the bar to raise scores and everything. Representative Rokana. No, no opinion on her, but what she says is good too. My immigrant dad asked me where the missing 10% went when I scored a 90. Exactly. When we were growing up, I was lucky enough to go to school in the 80s and early 90s when the Department of Education had just started in 1979. So it hadn't, what they do these days with lowering the bar and everything, hadn't caught on yet. And we actually got taught stuff, and not just how to recite and remember stuff. We actually got taught like how to think about things and how stuff works and why it worked the way it did. Not just here's the question, go find the answer and remember it. And we had more retention. They made it like we wanted to get involved and figure out why stuff worked. Anyways, yeah, said her migrant dad asked me where my missing 10% went when I scored a 90 because he was expecting an A. That A used to be 91 to 100. Now, I have no idea what it is now. I'm sure it's lower than that already, and they wanted to go even lower. He came to America for a chance to work hard and pursue excellence. Given A's for 80% and no homework is not equity. It betrays the American dream and every parent who wants more for their kids. I could not agree more. Like I said, you can't keep lowering the bar just to make your scores look better when in the real life those kids are going to be doomed. They can't think, they can't function. They'll need a safe space and all that. Anyways, what I was saying, or they all said it's pulled out. Um, they didn't back all the way out. If you read this right here in a statement on Wednesday, the superintendent Maria Sue said no changes were adopted. The plan is on hold. Basically, they're waiting until they get some people in there that agree with the agenda, and they're going to do it anyways. Right there in plan, it's on hold. They didn't back out. They're not saying no. It's on hold. So yeah, that's still an agenda that they want to be done. So, like I was talking, we grew up. I'm Gen X. I was born 79, so I'm on the cusp. I don't know. A lot of people say I'm Gen X. I agree with it. I like to. I was a worldly traveler at a young age. Didn't have a lot of supervision, and so we pretty much had to think for ourselves and figure things out. And we did. And we're survivors, and we don't put our feelings over emotions too much. So, I mean, over logic. We use our logic. We figure stuff out. We just no bullshit. Cut to the chase. So, like I was saying, we're gonna get into the reason why some of this stuff happens and the educational system in America. Um, I've read this a long time ago, and it's always interested me. Um, it's abstract. This is on PubMed, so these are published on the government site National Library of Medicine. the medicine involves psychology and all that stuff. And this is on the subject of intelligence. Abstract. The article from Robert Moranto and Jonathan Y. Why Intelligence is Missing from the American Education Policy and Practice and What Can Be Done About It. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing. I will put the link to it in the comments. Like I said, I have some Gen X. I still take notes on paper, so I have some sections I do want to get into it. I will read you the intro. Um, this essay is a collaboration between a political scientist and a psychologist who each research areas related to U.S. education policy. So that's what they focus on. Their research is solely based, or not solely, but strictly, when it gets down to it, they deep dive into the education policy in the United States. Moranto, the political scientist, served in the U.S. government, so probably he knows how things work within the Department of Education, and he has an understanding of it. Um, and on a local school board. Now that's interesting because of the things he says during this. So he actually worked on a school board and he has hands-on. It's probably a great source, but he does. There's a lot of sources in this article. If you actually look it up yourself, like I said, I'll link it in the comments for you to do your own research. Um, that's one of my biggest things here. Never take anything, even me. Just don't take me for my word. I'm doing this hoping that you'll go look it up for yourself and make your own opinions. I'm giving you my opinions of it, um, my my logical conclusion using my own critical thinking skills. No spin. I'm just telling you what I read, what I find, and what I think about it. And I hope that you will go look it up yourself and don't just take it for the word. If you agree, that's great. If you don't, that's also great. Nobody's always going to agree, but at least go look it up. Don't just Google something, read the headline, and say, think you know it. A lot of times, if you do that and you actually open the article, I'll do another whole episode on that. You could search something on Google and the headline will tell you what they think you want to see, and you just stop and you think you're right, but then you open the article and the numbers and all that, the data doesn't add up when you actually dig into it. So don't just take Google at its face. Dig deeper, research, do your own due diligence. All right, so Moranto is in the school board system. Way started out as a researcher in the field of intelligence, which is the other important aspect of this um, thesis. He now studies education policy through the lens of psychology, including how and where the concept of intelligence can be more fruitfully integrated into the education policy research. If the research on how that can be, like the title says, it's missing. There's no intelligence in the education system these days. The primary goal is to explore the notion of intelligence and largely absence in the field of education. They consider why intelligence could be useful in education and some ideas on what can be done about it. All right, we'll go on to the next. 2-1, this first section. Look at my notes where I wanted to read up to. I will start. The notion, they're putting G here as intelligence. The notion of intelligence is among the most established, replicated, and influential predictors of numerous life outcomes, including educational performance and attainment. Therefore, acknowledging and accepting individual differences in intelligence capacities and learning rates among students can both lead to a more robust and coherent research literature in the broad field of education research. For concrete examples, but they give you, that's why I say there's a lot of references in here. How it can help education, as well as finding solutions that will work and ruling out those unlikely to help children. That's good. So what they want to do is dig more into using courses that promote intelligence, and of course, ones that they don't think work, don't use them. For example, understanding that intelligence is measured pretty much in any standardized ability or achievement test. That's what they want to do, is make sure that, I mean, they do some little critical thinking thing in school, I believe. I know they do when we were, like I said, ours were a lot more. The Department of Education hadn't got a hold yet, so it was more about thinking. Um, uh, if I guess they're saying if it's included in any standardized ability, it suggests that the literatures could be productively informed by one another just by that link alone. So what that means is your school books would, their literature would have to include more philosophy and exploring ideas of why things work and how they work, and instead of, like I said, just memorizing and repeating. Um, that's what this article goes on and talks about the cognitive knowledge and all that, and embracing intelligence rather than rejecting the scientific knowledge that keeps education from developing curricula that would serve the nation cognitively. Um, one, two, where's the other one I want to talk about? Basically, it says like the education. Well, we don't have a Department of Education, but the education field is has little interest in intelligence research right, and considerable skepticism regarding content knowledge. That means they don't really care if you understand what you're learning, as long as you could recite it long enough to take that test. So their scores go up and they get funded. But like I said, we'll get into that department. Their scores haven't gone up because of, we'll get into that later in this. Um, Accounting for intelligence among all groups of people in schools, beyond integrating the information about intelligence into the education research and education policy, accounting for the intelligence of teachers, administrators, or other people who interact with the students could also be useful. Now, remember, he's part of the education system. He worked for the government and on local school boards. And for him to say it could be useful means it's not there. That means they're not requiring intelligence out of their teachers and administrators. Research has indicated individuals who choose to become teachers tend to be drawn from the lower end of the ability distribution, at least among college graduates. That's what, even at that level, not just the students, but even at the teachers and the administration level, all they care about is conformity. It's wild. Um, this trend has been consistent for several decades, demonstrated using different ability and achievement measures and different samples over time. That means they've studied this for decades. And the intelligence bar, even for teachers, lower and lower and lower. Lower the bar, up your numbers. Wild. Let's see what else we find here. We might hypothesize that all else equal, more highly able teachers might more effectively challenge students. That is a sounds like a logical hypothesis to me. The smarter the teacher, the more able they are to pass that on. Um, for example, might more effectively challenge students, particularly more intellectually advanced or gifted students. Such teachers might innovate ways to serve the less intellectually advanced. Because I agree with, because if you're more intellectually, you could figure out how to deal with somebody that's having a problem instead of just wanting to be try cut across the board. Everybody has to do it this way. I had a problem like that when I went to college. Like I said, we were taught more on how to figure things out and expand on our own. So my first year of college, I had this math teacher. She literally called herself Queen Math. But anyways, so she's teaching us how to do our math, our trigonometry, and stuff like that. So she gives us a test one day. You know, I'm sitting there, I'm there every day doing answering questions. She gives us a test one day, and I did it my way, like the easiest way I could figure out, and answered everything exactly. I didn't miss one single answer. The total of my math problem was the total, the sum that it needed to be, and she failed me because I didn't do it specifically how she wanted me to. And that's a problem. That's what this is talking about. You're not promoting intelligence. You're demanding conformity. That, that's crazy. If a person can figure it out a different way than the teacher and still gets the exact same answer, that answer is right. But I mean, she marked every single question wrong, and let's just say I didn't go to that class anymore. I do not conform. All right. How education's history has led to the neglect of intelligence. Now, this goes into how they set up the system. Um, says in America, public schooling, the professional education leadership dominates the daily routines. In these respects, the field has far more influence over education than systematic education subfields like emotional psychology, which takes the study of intelligence more seriously. Principals and superintendents typically graduate with degrees in educational leadership. So there's courses that they're taking that specifically teach them how to teach, and that's how they get into the system. Like you have to follow these guidelines of educational leadership, not actual. Uh, you want to be a math teacher, you don't have to be a genius at math. You have to finish this course on how to be a educational leadership program and get all kinds of certificates. You don't really have to shine at the subject you're teaching, and this gets into that later also. Former superintendents influence and not infrequently lead schools of education with mainly second-tier universities which train the vast majority of American teachers. So it's not your higher education people that are getting teaching jobs, basically what it's saying. On a day-to-day basis, principals and superintendents select and retain or occasionally dismiss teachers and select which teachers gain promotions to administration. So it's set up like a business, like your whole education system. It's not really there for real education. It's there as a business model. And they have their administrators, which don't have to be educated, but then they're telling the people that are educating how they have to educate, and they don't care about what they're really teaching. They care about the numbers and following the rules and conformity. Here, American traditional public schools have a hierarchical structure which slow promotion. Typical high school principals have never taught a course over a decade, while private school principals sometimes still teach and often return full time to the classroom. That's what I mean. If you take your kid out of the public school, they're more than likely going to get a education from somebody who still teaches. There's going to, I mean, who, the person in charge of the school is still going to be a teacher and still furthering their knowledge and intelligence and education, and it's just a whole better system, if you ask me, than this conformity system we have today. Um, Both their educational leadership programs and by selection and self-selection as permanent administrators, public school leaders value compliance, teamwork, and order. And this has been the case of policymakers since the early 20th century. It's a profession. Professions are most malleable in their beginnings when the founders and institutions start. When they come together, that's when they're the most malleable. They form how they want to do things. And then, like I said, this is from the early 1900s is when they started doing this um, education as a business model. And so when they formed it, and it's pretty much stayed the same since then. The field of educational leadership arose in the early 20th century, and it remains influenced by the doctrines of that time. Like I just said, it hasn't changed. It's a business model. It doesn't care about making kids smarter or anything. It shows the founders of the field lacked optimism regarding the importance of intelligence and its malleability. They conceptualized intelligence as largely predetermined. Thus, efforts to improve intelligence through schooling were seen as quixotic and elitist. Uh, Wish there was some elites that were a big part of making the school system like this because they wanted more factory workers. But in a way, that's kind of true because if you notice, the elites they don't send their kids to these public schools, so they do think that you need more intelligence and be taught to use your intelligence, which doesn't happen in the schools they want us peons to go to. Further, in part to distinguish themselves from other university-based disciplines and to appeal to pragmatic school boards largely made up of businessmen. And the founders of the educational leadership adopted scientific management models imported from business. That's what I was just talking about. You have your old businessmen and factory owners and oil conglomerates. They were on this board of founders for the educational leadership program because they wanted workers. They wanted people that would stay in line, say yes, sir, take the paycheck, don't think about anything that's going on. Just do your job, shut up, show up on time every day, clock out when you're supposed to. And that's what they wanted. That's what the school was set up to do. It's a factory farm. There's another part I wanted to show you here. It's a direct quote about that, where it says it was set up to be a factory. It says it's devised by Franklin Taylor. The management dictated that good managers observe workplace. See, they're even relating the school to a workplace. Break down each step in the production process and find the most efficient techniques, then use bonuses to persuade the workers to learn and use that one best way. That's what I was just talking about with the college teacher. It was no matter if you could do it right or do it better, you have to do it this way or I'm failing you. And she failed me, even though, like I said, she literally said you got every question right, but you didn't do it this way, so I had to give you an F. That's nonsense to me. This management philosophy does not demand intelligence in managers and positively scorns intelligence in employees. That's what I was talking about earlier. They don't want smart teachers because smart teachers wouldn't want to teach the BS bullshit that they're told to teach if they don't think it's right. And right here, this last sentence, ideal teachers should be trainable towards compliance rather than out of the box thinkers. And they give you a source on where to quote that. As I said, there's sources all throughout this. I'll drop the link in the comments. You could look it up, go through those sources I have, and everything checks out. um, Progressive reforms, scientific. This goes more into about the business structure of the educational field. Right here's the quote I was talking about. Elwood Gubberly, the Dean of the School of Education at Stanford University and one of the founders of this education leadership as a field, explained schools, before the year 1900, schools had been a manufacturing establishment running at low grade efficiency. They're manufacturing workers. And before they came up with this reform, if you call it a reform, they considered it being at low efficiency because they focused more on actual learning and intelligence instead of conformity and doing what you're told. Like back then, you hear about all the time they used to have. Uh, we had a couple you could elect electric classes if you were good at something, but they actually used to track the kids that excelled at something and would move them in and had special classes just for that. And it wasn't like you had to elect one. It was if you're good at this, you're going here to learn it more because we want you to excel. Now it's like if you're good at this, okay, you'll get an A, but you're not going anywhere else, and you're still doing the work. Like it was different by the time I had moved. I went to 80s in the 80s in school on the north side of Chicago, and by the second grade we had already learned multiplication tables and trees, and we had to move to the south side of Chicago, and it was the I moved there in the sixth grade, fifth grade or sixth grade. Anyways, we didn't start doing multiplications trees there until the end of the seventh grade, and people were shocked that I already knew how to do it. And like I said, that was moving into the 90s and stuff, and education had got a hold, I guess, by then. And it was just weird because I already knew. I'm like, well, we did this in the third grade here, and they were teaching it like it was brand new in the seventh grade, and it just blew my mind. Anyways, moving on. Excuse me. The field of educational leadership aimed to change in the early 20th century, many decades before No Child Left Behind, another lowering the bar initiative. Um, Before No Child Left Behind forced public schools to report test scores to the public, large school systems run by administrative progressives used widespread quantification in efforts to centralize control at the principal and superintendent level, minimizing the teacher autonomy and initiative. So centralized. I mean, you do it this way, you step out of bounds, you're gone. Um, in practice, talks about the decisions teachers have to make and manage their complex workforce makes their work counterproductive. More scientific management like efforts to control the teachers led to the unions through the 20th century. Unions is a whole nother episode. But anyways, what this says is when it led to the unions, their unions started behaving like industrial unions instead of professional organizations. So it was the same. They don't care about the intelligence either. It's just got to have this much pay, and we need to make more off the union dues. So we're gonna go tell them you need another 25-cent raise. If not, you got to starve on a picket line with us till we get it. But yeah, like I said, that's a whole nother episode. um, a pedagogical progressive Dewey influenced the schools of education and the training and selection of teachers. Now, Dewey was one, he wanted the teachers to be smart, and he was trying to influence them over training the teachers and selecting them. But during his uh, leadership, I guess you could say, they started watering down the course content. So even if you did have smart teachers, they could only teach a certain course that was approved by them. And like I said, it was one thing. You have to do it this way. Can't think outside the box and all that stuff. But the administrative progressives, which are the business people who dominated the education leadership, had far more real world influence. Of course, they were your J.P. Morgans and stuff like that that wanted little farms to raise factory workers. Um, they had enormous regard for neither group had enormous regard for intelligence, nor the academic content unless narrowly tailored to utilitarian and typically vocational ends. If you remember, like I said, in the 80s And I'm sure I know in the 70s, I heard my dad and all of them talk about it, they had more shop classes and teach you how to work on cars and mechanic classes and lumber and all that stuff for vocation. But that was good stuff to learn. Now they have vocation schools specifically because they took it out of the education system, because that kind of stuff does you it teaches you to think, and you're dealing with machinery and other stuff, and it teaches you how to use and innovate. And so they're trying to weed that out. I live in the South now, and they still have agricultural, which is good. And I think, yeah, the high schools here, they still have a shop class, and there's one that still has the mechanic where they work on cars, which is good things. But like I said, that's basically because of the area I'm in. Those are the kind of jobs that are available, and it was still set up to be farm workers. And I don't mean farm. I mean the schools were the farms to grow workers for the establishments. Here they're asking you, says one could imagine an alternative past in which the education leadership as a field of study embraced rigorous subfields of psychology such as cognitive or IO psychology, or perhaps even history and government. They did a history and government. Well, no, I guess they don't. They'll teach you the parts that they want you to pass a test for. They don't actually go into the whole what you need to know. They'll ask you a certain question. They'll say, "What is the Ninth Amendment?" So all you need to know, what is the Ninth Amendment? They don't teach you and go over the whole thing and teach you how you need to know all your rights and all that. And it's not set up for you to be knowledgeable. It's set up for you to remember, recite, and not retain. State departments of education, influenced by the schools of education, have required that a vast majority of traditional public schools hire teachers, and administrator schools of education have trained and certified, thus limiting the impetus for reform. That's what I was saying. They Once they founded this system, they set up ways to keep it that way, and it has not changed since then. Um, it says in this way, K through 12 public education, like most professions, develops distinct selection and training pathways, organizations, and certification systems. So they set up their own little path to be a teacher, and none of it has to do with how smart you are. It's how much you can conform. Stotsky noted that at times in the past, some states' teacher certification requirements had significant rigor via teacher licensure tests. Unfortunately, since at least the 1950s, states have lowered the standards to make sure public schools can recruit a sufficient number of teachers to fill the classrooms. That's all they care about. Numbers, numbers, numbers to get their funding, funding, funding. And here's like the difference from higher education, where anybody that's been to college, they do have classes that is pretty much just thinking. You come up with your own theses, and they'll teach you like exploring business models and trying to make your own business. And there's like you're on your own, but they want to not really on your own. Like they want to see that you are following legit business practices, but they leave it up to you. It's your idea of what you want to do, and you write your thesis and stuff about it. um, Others have demonstrated as a college major education on both undergraduate and graduate levels lack vigor. It portrays the field as having phony professionalism. That's We're talking about the K through 12 system, and I'll add to that public college systems, state funded, do the same thing. Um, It portrayed them as having phony professionalism with positions based on non-challenging undergraduate, master's, and doctorate degrees rather than actual knowledge or achievement. That's what I mean. Teachers don't have to know what they're teaching. They give them a book with the answers with it, and they tell them you got to teach it this way and this way only. If they don't do it this way, you don't give them good grades. Lavery, this role lacks credibility among academic elites. It says those teaching in the universities think of those in ed schools, meaning K-12, as being academically weak and narrowly vocational. They see ed school teachers not as their peers in the world of higher education, but as an embarrassment, who should not be a part of the university at all. To them, the ed schools look less like a school of medicine than a school of cosmetology. Doesn't mean these higher up professors, they're not, they're usually not teachers from other schools. They've done actual things out in the world on their subject other than teaching, and it's wild the difference, the, especially the private. Like they keep using the word elite in here, and I hate it. But the elite are smart enough to know that they're not going to use the public education system that they want you to go to, because that's and it's not about, they just know what it's set up for. They don't want their kids to be little factory workers and all stuff like that. I'll put it that way. Uh, it's bullshit. Like I said, if you have the means, you should get your kid out of the public education system. Also, in my opinion, it's not set up to make them smart or intelligent. Here's it even says that the elites increasingly attend and typically send their own children to private schools that do not use teacher or leader certification as a criteria for employment. That's a good thing, because the certifications and stuff like that are state and government level conformity. You have to, like, it burns me up when people say, "Oh, you if you're knowledgeable on a subject and you talk about it, but you don't have a degree, so they think you don't know anything." And they'll say, "Well, he's got a degree. I gotta listen to him." That degree, like I said, basically, now there are some. I won't take all. There are some that go into a field and they get that degree because they really like it and they understand it and they're knowledgeable about it. But there's some, the education system will put out these, if you do this, you'll make this much money, and that's all that cares people. So as long as they can go and remember and recite until they get out of there, that's all those people are. There's a lot of dumb people with degrees, especially when it comes to common sense or street knowledge. There's a lot of stupid ass people that have degrees. There's a lot of people that don't have degrees that know a lot more. I mean, Jesus, in today's day and age, you got Einstein's knowledge at your fingertips, and you're going to tell me you need a degree to read it and understand it? But yeah, education does not equal intelligence. I guess that's the whole point of the show. Education does not equal intelligence. Education is conformity. Let's dive back into this. I found some other points, but there's a lot to read here. I'm not going to read it all, so I'm trying not to make it too long. Uh, Here they set up these cardinal principles of education in 1918 by the U.S. government, and it was like talking about what they wanted to. They had 7 cardinal principles about what they wanted to instill, and at that time they still did want intelligence, stuff like that. Um, Rapid growth meant that the organizational ideologies and practices could be imposed on institutionalized among the new personnel, in a sharp contrast to prior justification of secondary schooling. Only one of the 7 cardinal principles concerned academic achievement. the single goal and command of fundamental process. That's the one cardinal principle they wanted. The command of the fundamental processes was to cover nearly all scholarly disciplines. That's crazy. The other goals that they left out were health, and they had PE class, but were, were the use of leisure, like what you do in your free time, get a hobby. Like I say, in the 80s, they still, they taught us this stuff: citizenship, worthy home membership, vocation, and ethical character. While few living teachers and educational leaders have ever heard of the cardinal principles, the document still defines the field. So, like that just said, they only use one of them. And here, Moranto, the person who's writing this article, he says nearly 60 years after the principles were publication, a superintendent told one of us that you do not understand the purpose of the public education system. The purpose of the public education is not to educate students. There's a superintendent that's from the education management field. In his own words, the purpose of the public education is not to educate students. The purpose of public education is to provide an education for the few who want it. Other students would have to be kept in schools, since otherwise crime would go up and unemployment would go up. That's plain English. It's not to educate your kids, it's to have custody of them and teach them, not teach them, tell them what to do and what to think. It's all the public education system is. So we'll talk about its key goals. Ladry says if school subjects have to be adjusted to the capacity of the students and to the requirements of the job market, and if most students have modest capacities and most jobs have modest skill requirements, then only a few classes need provide rigorous academic content for the college-bound elite, while most students need classes that are less academic, less demanding, and better suited for their modest future roles in society. This is a straightforward prescription for diluting the academic content. All these people that are in this field are telling you public education is not to educate your child. Evidence suggests that in hiring teachers, typical public school principals do not take cognitive ability or subject matter knowledge into account. As I was talking about earlier, the teacher doesn't even have to know the field that they're teaching. They give them the answer book. In short, the ideology of education as a field largely explains its failure to embrace intelligence as a goal or as a concept. They don't even want to think about it. Further, until other professional occupations were open to women and minorities, high levels of female and minority teachers, they call them human capital, right in this thing, human capital, were assured. Only since 1970 has teacher quality and cognitive ability measures like SAT fallen. So since the 70s, the intelligence of the teaching staff has fallen. Estimates indicate that among female high school graduates in the top tenth of cognitive ability, the proportion that enter teaching declined roughly a quarter in the early 70s to a tenth in the early 2000s. This happened at the very time when elites began to stress the importance of students making gains in cognitive ability for national economic success. Yet the low level of teacher cognitive ability that has stretched across many decades back to the 40s, across 5 independent sources tested, has played into the approaches of traditional educational leaders, teachers' unions, and many educational reformers. So you have the elite are even saying what's important in education, but since this system has already been set up, they go against that. They want workers, factory men. Right here, to a varying degree, all are stuck in the early 20th century factory model of schooling. Low cognitive ability teachers are more compliant and largely symbolic reforms developed by policymakers also more also will also offer more solidarity to unions. Whole education system is set up as an agenda. That's crazy. Shosky tries to make an argument that they lowered the bar. Basically, in my words, he's saying that it was over racism, that it was to reflect a desire for racially diverse teaching corps. If that was the goal, that is kind of racism because they're trying to say that non-white people are stupid, so they had to lower the bar. Um, I'm sure all you non-white people don't agree with that, but that's what their thinking was, according to this guy. That non-white people were stupider, so we got to make it easier for non-white people to get in. That is racist. But the writer of this article argues, though, that that's not the case. It's not really. I'm not arguing that there wasn't racism back then, and they might have done that. But the one writing this article says it wasn't really a factor until the 70s, long after, which that makes sense. They did start doing it a lot more in the 70s. Um, I don't want to say his name, but there are presidents and all that made remarks talking about non-white people were stupid, so we had to help them out. And I'm not saying I agree with that, and I'm sure you don't either. But that's when they did start doing it. Um, the writers of this article say we argue that was not a factor until the 70s, until the institutionalization of the certification practices long after the certification practices. Diversity goals did not lower the barriers to entry into the teaching profession, but were later used by education professors to justify the reduced academic rigor. So what that means is since the quality of education went down, the white administrators tried to use the lowering of the bar as the excuse and trying to make it like they shouldn't have let non-white people in, basically, is what they're saying, which is bullshit. Is because of this whole model that they set up. But they always try, yeah, I'll say it. You look at how this set up, and this is basically telling you why everything happened, but the ones that are doing it to you always try to make it a racial thing and want you to feel like it was because of you, and it wasn't. They always want to find another. Can't say it was our fault. It was it was racism. That's basically what they're saying, and that's bullshit. There was racism going on, but every time they do something fucked up, then they want to point the finger and say, "Oh, it's because of racism or sexism or all kinds of shit," instead of what they're actually doing. Government loves to break your legs and hand you a wheelchair so they can feel like saviors. If you haven't figured that out, says defining itself as distinct from and more pragmatic than the more scholarly segments of higher education. Education as a field values the trappings of education, non-rigorous degrees, and certifications for its employment, but not actual reflections of intelligence or content knowledge. That's what this whole thing is about. They don't care that you understand what you're doing. They just want you to be able to recite it, whether they know you remember it. Well, I mean, you remember it until you take a test, but they don't care that you understand it. They don't care that you know how it works and why it works that way. They just want you to repeat what they told you it means. Right here. Now, Hirsch wrote the core knowledge curricula, and says one contemptuous educator asked him if he actually thought that learning more content made him a better person. Um, said Hirsch recounted how conventional educators often expressed astonishment that he actually enjoyed learning the facts and the stories that he put into his curricula, and asked them if they thought that learning more made him a better person. That's crazy. And that's that way the whole system's set up. Decades before fake news, the field of education had espoused limited appreciation for facts. Instead, they embraced the approach that we teach children, not subjects. They quoted that as an actual thing the education system said. We teach children, not subjects. What that means is they teach children what to do, how to do it, when to do it, fall in line, conformity. To be clear, academic skill development and subject matter should not be the sole goals of schooling. Personal relationships, including school level affinities and school spirit, should also matter. I guess. I can see that if you're on a sports team. But they've also made the athletics too much a part of school. It talks about that a little bit in here too. So, section 4 says, why is the notion of intelligence absent in the field of education? Um, it is true that there are world-class scholars doing intelligence research in educational science. In the U.S., intelligence as a topic remains less widely accepted. That makes no sense to me. Intelligence researchers and social scientists, our goal is to uncover what is true scientifically. That is not the primary goal of the field of K through 12 education, as they describe through this whole thing, is what they're saying. Anyways, yeah, this is a pretty long article. Like I said, they have a lot of sources in here. I will put this link in there. Um, it's a lot more to read, but basically, you get the gist of it. Your public education system is not there to educate; it's there to teach them how to be little conformists and yes men and yes women. Um, like the one quote said earlier, it's there for the people who want it. That like I said, there's people that want to be in a certain field, so they will excel, and it's not. It has nothing to do with the way the education system is teaching them. It's like they just grasp it and they're actually interested in it, and they don't pretty much don't have to be taught. They'll grab a book and teach it to themselves. That's what intelligent people do. They don't sit there and wait for somebody to tell them how to think about something or how something works. They sit down and they figure it out for themselves and they go with it. And when it comes time for the test, they already know the stuff. I can tell you right now, I hand to God, and my mother would agree by it. I never handed in one single piece of homework from school, and I never failed a grade. I never failed a test, and it was just I I actually retained stuff, and I wanted to know why and how things worked, and I was more interested in it than a lot of the kids that got the A's because they were just doing it to remember it long enough to pass the test. And then you could ask me something about it months later, and I still knew it. It was just I love knowledge. I didn't like being taught, but I love knowledge. I love learning about anything and everything. But like I said, I don't have the degrees, but I had the better test scores. I can guarantee you that. And it's just because I didn't conform to their little system. Anyways, like I said, I will post this link. It's a good read, kind of long, a lot of sources. Um, so moving on to that, I guess we'll start winding it down. Uh, like I read earlier in this, everything started turning for the worse during the 70s. And a topic that has been hot now is where Trump ended the Department of Education by executive order. So, like I said, that was in the 70s, started going downhill. Guess what was started in 1979? United States Department of Education. So that's when all this came about. 1979. Now let's take a look at high school tests since 1979. Well, probably not since 1979, but in 40 years. A little website called Education by the Numbers. They focus strictly on educational topics and stuff like that, and different learning skills. And well, here's an article published by them. High school test scores haven't improved for 40 years. 40 years. This was by June, back in 2013. It hadn't improved at all for 30 years. Just flatline. That was. I mean, we were improving up until then. The Department of Education came into play, and high school just stayed there. And it's because they put in these, you got to do it this way, and that's it. So they set a baseline, and then it does talk about, kind of correlates to what we were talking about earlier, because it does talk about in this article. I'm not going to read this whole article either. Um, but yeah, 40 years. It even starts out, is U.S. high school a wasteland, or are teenagers getting a better education today than they were 40 years ago? That puzzle, that's a puzzle offered in a release of national test scores on July 27, 2013. Now, I have read this, and what it's saying, they're using a scale. 9-year olds and 13-year olds have improved, and lower students that have what I guess what they consider generally did poor in the past are doing better now. But the top tier students have flatlined. And to me, logically, the lowering the bar is what's making it easier for those lower level students to move up, which is what we began this whole story about. They want to bring F's up to C's. And but this article, I don't want to say, to me, it has a left wing spin and is standing up for that kind of stuff, bringing up that's a totally feelings over logic thing. You want to bring up the lower students to make them feel like the higher students, but they're really not, because you're just calling the lower scores something better than what it actually has always been. You're lowering the bar for the lower person to look as good. That's not equity. That's not equality. But anyways, in this article, they try to put that spin on it because they're trying to say, oh, even though that's flatline, these lower students have come up. They're out here, the lower performing 17-year-olds make gains. But the scores that matter, like that should be improving, is our top tier intelligence and education has flatlined. There's been no improvement for 40 years while other countries have jumped way ahead of us. We're being left in the dust because we want factory model education. For example, a student who ranked top 90th in 1971 had a reading score of 342. In 2012, the reading score would be 340. That's actually less. Kind of, I guess you could say that ain't much of a difference, but it did go down. That's for math and reading. Math is same, similar story. It says biggest gains. Middle students show a bit of improvement, but no improvement among the top kids. Like I said, when the education Department of Education came into play, it just stalemated and kept. It was all lowering the bar policy, and it became all about factories and money and numbers. Nothing about making our kids smarter. Here, back in May 2013, attended a seminar at Martin Corney of Stanford University, who was analyzing different international data. By his conclusion was the same. The problem is at the top. The U.S. top students are way behind top students in other countries because we stopped raising the bar. We stopped continuing education. We found a little model that fit for the industrialized institutions and the unions, and made all the factories happy that we were farming little workers for them, and we stopped right there. You had to meet this level, and that was it. There's no improvement. And I guess I'm gonna wind it down. I hope you get the gist of it. You can't keep lowering the bar and expect a better outcome. That's not equality. That's not equity. It's totally putting some agenda, and they want you to put your feelings over logic. What's best for everybody is everybody to try to hit that top goal, not saying, well, this guy's up here, you got an F, so we're going to give you a C so it looks like you're up there. That's not helping nobody, and I hope you are smart enough to realize that. I'm going to put this link in the comment. You can read it for yourself if you want, and just, as always, put your logic over your emotions and fuck your feelings. It's Logical Layman signing out. Please like and subscribe down below, and I'll catch you on the next one.